They told him he wasn't disabled enough. After everything he'd been through, years of service, physical pain that didn't fade, nights haunted by what he'd seen, he sat across from a claims officer who barely looked up before stamping denied. The official reason? Not enough evidence. But what they didn't realize was that buried in his medical file was one small, overlooked detail. A detail so specific, so clear, that once it was brought to light by the right doctor, everything changed. This isn't just about one man. It's about the thousands of veterans who are told their suffering doesn't meet the government's threshold, who are forced to fight twice, once in war and again when they come home. Today, we're going to walk you through a true story that reveals how one veteran went from rejected to fully recognized, all because someone finally paid attention to what really mattered. Stick around, because by the end of this video, you'll know how one piece of medical truth turned a denial into a victory, and how it might do the same for someone you care about. It started like it does for so many veterans, quiet frustration and endless waiting. After returning home, Mark didn't ask for sympathy. He didn't talk much about the things he'd seen, or the pain he carried in his back, his joints, and somewhere deeper that was harder to explain. But when the headaches got worse and the nightmares became more than just bad dreams, he finally filed for disability benefits. The VA response? Denied. They told him his condition wasn't service-connected. That phrase hit harder than expected. How could they say that when every symptom started after deployment? When even standing up some mornings felt like a battle of its own? He appealed, gathering his paperwork, service records, and a letter from his commanding officer. Still, nothing. The VA said there wasn't sufficient medical evidence. It was as if his pain didn't exist because they couldn't see it on a single scan. Mark started to doubt himself. Was he imagining it? Was it really not enough? But what the VA didn't count on was that Mark wasn't done fighting. Not yet. A friend from his unit suggested he get a second opinion. Not from a regular physician, but from a specialist who'd worked with veterans for years. That single piece of advice would change everything. Because when that doctor sat down with Mark's full history, something immediately stood out. A line buried deep in a field hospital record, noting exposure to a particular blast radius known to cause traumatic brain injury symptoms years after the fact. The doctor dug deeper, piecing together symptoms that had been dismissed as minor. Memory issues, migraines, mood swings, sleep disturbances. All signs that align perfectly with mild TBI, a condition frequently missed, but devastating if left untreated. And here's where things got serious. That buried note became a medical link. Proof that what Mark was experiencing wasn't random, and certainly not imagined. It was the overlooked truth that made denial impossible to justify. This detail, so small, so easily ignored, was enough for a full reevaluation, and for the first time, the conversation shifted. The VA didn't just look at Mark's symptoms. They looked at the cause. His condition was no longer unverified. It was real, documented, and clearly service-connected. But that was only the beginning of what came next. What most people don't realize is how powerful a medical nexus letter can be, especially when it's written by the right person. In Mark's case, that one document, barely 2 pages long, turned his case around. But it wasn't just what the letter said, it was who wrote it and how it connected the dots. A medical nexus letter isn't just a note from a doctor saying you're sick. It's a formal, detailed explanation that links a veteran's current condition directly to their military service. Without that link, the VA has an easy out. They can claim the condition is unrelated. But with it, everything changes. Mark's doctor didn't just mention his symptoms. He outlined the timeline. How Mark was exposed to concussive blasts in 2007, how symptoms like headaches and irritability started showing up months later, and how those symptoms gradually escalated. He cited studies showing delayed onset of brain trauma and connected those facts directly to Mark's service records. It was thorough, it was specific, and most importantly, it was undeniable. But the real twist? The letter didn't come from a VA doctor. It came from an independent physician who specialized in evaluating veterans for complex, chronic conditions. Because here's what many don't know. VA doctors are often overwhelmed, limited in time, and discouraged from taking strong positions that challenge the agency's own rules. Independent doctors, especially those with a history of working with veterans, don't have that restriction. They can say what they actually believe. They can push back against weak denials, and they can provide the kind of clear, confident statement that forces the VA to take another look. After submitting the Nexus letter, Mark's claim wasn't just reopened. It was escalated. The tone of communication shifted. Suddenly, the VA wasn't questioning his diagnosis. They were requesting further evidence to process the claim. Within months, he was approved, but not just approved for a minor rating. The letter laid the groundwork for a full reconsideration of the severity of his symptoms, which meant Mark's rating jumped far higher than he'd expected. What's even more telling, Mark wasn't the only one. Dozens of other veterans he'd served had faced the same resistance. But once they got those letters, once their conditions were validated by independent, experienced professionals, their cases started getting traction. The difference wasn't in the symptoms. It was in the evidence. And the VA, despite its reputation, can't ignore solid, medically backed proof forever. Still, getting the right kind of letter isn't easy. You need a doctor who knows how to phrase it, who understands what the VA looks for, and who's willing to take the time to write it properly. Too many get generic letters that say it's possible or it might be linked. That kind of vague language won't cut it. The letter has to say it's at least as likely as not, that exact phrase. Without that, the VA can toss it aside. Mark learned that the hard way. His first Nexus letter, written by a family doctor, was too cautious. The second one, from a veteran-experienced neurologist, was a game changer. And what happened next would make him realize just how many others were quietly suffering, simply because no one had told him about this one crucial step. The real breakthrough came when Mark's attorney uncovered a lesser-known loophole buried deep in the VA's regulations, something called the presumption of aggravation. Most veterans have never even heard of it, and honestly, that's not by accident. The VA doesn't exactly advertise it, but it can change everything for a veteran whose pre-existing condition worsened during service. In Mark's case, he had documented anxiety before enlisting. Nothing severe, just occasional episodes. But during his deployment, those symptoms escalated dramatically. He developed panic attacks, trouble sleeping, and emotional detachment, which followed him long after returning home. Initially, the VA denied his claim, saying the condition predated service. But what they failed to consider or conveniently ignored was that if a condition gets worse during service, even slightly, and it wasn't clearly due to natural progression, it should be considered service-connected. That's what the presumption of aggravation says. It's not just a technicality. It's a legal rule the VA is obligated to follow. And in Mark's case, once this was pointed out, the whole conversation changed. The turning point came when Mark's legal team requested a copy of his entrance and exit medical evaluations. What they found was subtle, but it was enough. His intake forms mentioned mild anxiety, but by the time he left active duty, the records noted severe impairment in medication use. That was the missing link. The VA couldn't deny that the condition had worsened while he was in uniform. The only way they could avoid granting service connection was to prove that it would have gotten worse anyway, even without the stress of war zones, sleep deprivation, and repeated trauma. And they couldn't do that. Suddenly, the burden shifted. The VA was no longer questioning whether he had anxiety. They were scrambling to justify why they hadn't already granted his claim. The presumption rule forced him to take a second look, and this time with a very different lens. Mark's case, once dismissed as non-service connected, was reopened and fast-tracked for reconsideration. Within 90 days, his disability rating increased, and his retroactive benefits were paid out, years of back pay he'd never expected to see. What's wild is that Mark's situation isn't unique. So many veterans are sitting on denied claims simply because they don't know this rule exists. They hear pre-existing condition and give up. But the truth is, if your condition got worse while serving, even a little, and there's no clear medical reason why it would have progressed on its own, the law is supposed to be on your side. The VA just hopes you don't know that. And here's the kicker. This loophole doesn't require a new diagnosis or dramatic new evidence. It just requires a clear comparison of your condition before and after service. Medical records, testimony from fellow service members, Even personal journals can all be used to demonstrate aggravation. The key is knowing how to present it. Mark's experience taught him that the system isn't just broken, it's strategically confusing. But once you learn how to work within it, or better yet, around it, the results can be life-changing. And what happened after his case was approved? Let's just say the ripple effects were much bigger than he ever expected. The twist that changed everything came from a single line buried in Mark's service records, something even his previous representatives had overlooked. It was a brief mention of exposure to burn pits during his deployment in Iraq. At the time, it seemed insignificant. Nearly everyone on base was exposed, and most claims involving burn pits were dismissed due to lack of conclusive evidence. But what Mark didn't know was that recent legislation had quietly shifted the rules in his favor. In 2022, a major law known as the PACT Act was passed. It expanded the list of conditions presumed to be linked to toxic exposure, especially from burn pits, and it removed one of the biggest obstacles veterans like Mark had faced for years: the burden of proof. Before the PACT Act, veterans had to prove a direct medical connection between their illness and the toxins they were exposed to. That meant expensive tests, lengthy appeals, and often outright rejection. But under the new law, if a veteran served in specific locations during certain time frames and later developed specific conditions like respiratory illness, cancers, or even certain autoimmune diseases, the VA now had to presume it was service-connected. The game had changed, but no one told Mark. His prior claims had been evaluated using the old rules. He had submitted evidence, reports, even witness statements, all ignored because he couldn't prove the exact cause. But now, thanks to the new legislation, none of that mattered if his condition was on the presumptive list. And the VA could no longer demand that kind of evidence. They were required to approve his claim, unless they could prove the illness was caused by something else entirely, which is almost impossible. Once this was flagged by a new advocate helping Mark with his case, the difference was immediate. The VA reclassified his condition as presumptive under the PACT Act. No additional medical opinions, no drawn-out appeals. Within 45 days, his disability rating was upgraded, and his benefits increased significantly. What's more, he became eligible for retroactive pay, going back to the original date he filed, years earlier. And this wasn't just about one man. Across the country, thousands of veterans like Mark were finally being recognized. Conditions that had been brushed off for decades were suddenly being treated seriously. Respiratory problems, chronic fatigue, rare cancers. Things that had long been labeled unrelated to service were now being approved, thanks to a shift that most veterans didn't even realize had happened. The sad truth is that this detail, this one line about burn pit exposure, had been sitting in Mark's file for years. It took a sharp-eyed advocate and an understanding of new laws to bring it to light, which raises the question, how many other veterans are sitting on valid claims simply because no one has looked closely enough? For Mark, that overlooked line wasn't just a forgotten note. It was the key to unlocking the benefits he had been denied for over a decade. And what happened next would reveal just how far the system had gone to keep cases like his buried. What came next exposed just how broken the system really was. When Mark's new advocate requested a full review of his file under the updated legislation, they discovered something troubling. His original claims hadn't just been denied. They had been mishandled. Key pieces of evidence, including military treatment records and deployment-related health evaluations, were either ignored or improperly categorized. One medical report that clearly linked his condition to his time in Iraq had been marked non-service related, without any explanation. It wasn't an oversight, it was a pattern. As Mark's case was re-examined under the PACT Act, it became clear this wasn't the only one. The VA's own internal data revealed that thousands of claims had been evaluated before the rule changed using outdated standards. And instead of automatically revisiting those denied claims, the agency placed the burden on veterans to refile, often without even notifying them that the rules had changed. Veterans like Mark, who had already been turned away multiple times, were expected to start from scratch, unless someone told them otherwise. For years, veterans were being told, "You don't qualify," when in fact they did, if only their claim had been filed a year later or their doctor had used different wording. The most painful part? Many of those denied gave up entirely. Some passed away before the system caught up. Others ran out of money, lost homes, or went without treatment, all because of technicalities that could have been corrected with a simple review. But that review rarely came. Mark's experience wasn't unique, but it was revealing. Once his file was flagged and reopened, his new advocate began finding similar cases, veterans with exposure-related illnesses who had been denied on flimsy grounds, despite having nearly identical service records. Some had been told their illnesses were due to aging, lifestyle, or genetics, anything but service. But when compared side by side, the similarities were impossible to ignore. Eventually, a small group of veterans, including Mark, began pushing for something more, a mass audit of past claims related to toxic exposure. They argued that if the VA now admits these illnesses are service-connected, then it should be their responsibility to go back and correct the mistakes, not the veterans. And while the movement is gaining traction, change has been slow. Many veterans still have no idea their claims are eligible for reconsideration under the PACT Act. What Mark's journey revealed was more than just a loophole. It was a flaw in the entire process. A system that punishes silence and rewards persistence, even when persistence comes at the cost of years of suffering. And in that gap between what veterans deserve and what they're told, countless lives have been left in limbo. For Mark, justice finally came, but only because someone dug deeper, asked harder questions, and refused to accept no as the final answer. And what that meant for others would soon become even more important. The final twist in Mark's case didn't come from a VA or his lawyer. It came from a doctor who almost didn't take the appointment. Dr. Patel was a civilian pulmonologist with no direct connection to the VA system. Mark saw her out of frustration, hoping for clarity that years of specialists hadn't given him. During their first meeting, she reviewed his symptoms, his military history, and, most importantly, his older chest scans. Then she asked a simple question. Has anyone ever looked at the scar tissue on your lungs from the perspective of burn pit exposure? Mark froze. He had mentioned burn pits to every doctor before her, but none had ever connected the dots. Dr. Patel ordered a more detailed analysis, and when the results came back, they confirmed what Mark had always believed. The pattern of damage in his lungs was consistent with prolonged inhalation of toxic particulate matter, the kind known to come from burn pit smoke. But that wasn't all. She also pointed out something else buried in his service record. During deployment, Mark had been issued a protective respirator for only part of his tour. After that, he was reassigned to outdoor duties near burn sites without one. That gap, documented in a forgotten equipment log, was the breakthrough. This single oversight gave Mark's advocate the ammunition they needed. The updated rules under the PACT Act now allow for presumptive service connection for burn pit exposure, but only if evidence supported the timeline. That respirator gap was a proof. It was specific, documented, and irrefutable. Within weeks, the claim that had been denied for over 7 years was overturned. Mark's disability rating jumped from 10% to 80%. The monthly payments changed his life. But more importantly, so did the acknowledgement. Someone had finally said, "We believe you." Mark's case now serves as an example for others. Advocacy groups are using it to train newer reps on what to look for: minor equipment logs, non-VA medical opinions, unexplained gaps in treatment, or symptoms that don't align neatly with checkboxes. Because sometimes it's not about what's missing. It's about what's been overlooked. Veterans are being encouraged to seek second opinions outside the VA system, especially from specialists familiar with deployment-related conditions. And Dr. Patel? She now volunteers part-time reviewing medical records for veteran support organizations. She says it still shocks her how many diagnoses are written off without proper environmental context. According to her, you don't need to be a VA insider to recognize when something isn't right. You just need to look closer. Mark's story is no longer just about him. It's about the thousands of veterans still being told they don't qualify. It's about what happens when one detail, one signature, one missed appointment, one old piece of paper is all that stands between denial and justice. And while many cases may still be stuck in the system, stories like his are giving others a reason to speak up, reapply, and look again, because the truth may already be sitting in their file, just waiting to be found. There are moments when it feels like the system is built to wear you down. When every form you fill out, every test you take, every appeal you file leads to the same result: a quiet denial, a polite rejection, or worse, silence. Mark's story proves that even in a system designed to help, it's still possible to be ignored, misjudged, or misunderstood for years. But also proves something more important. One overlooked detail can change everything. It wasn't a fancy lawyer or a powerful connection that turned his case around. It was a simple piece of evidence, a missing respirator during deployment, and a doctor who chose to listen closely. That's the part many veterans and their families forget. Sometimes the truth is already in the file, buried beneath years of appointments, paperwork, and frustration. And while the process might feel impossible, it isn't hopeless. If you're someone still fighting through the same maze, waiting for a response, re-explaining your pain, or try to prove what you already know to be true, don't give up yet. Get a second opinion. Look again at your records. Talk to someone new, because you don't need a miracle to win your case. Sometimes, all it takes is one person asking the right question at the right time. And if you've already been through this battle and found resolution, share your story. You never know who it might inspire or what detail you might help someone else uncover. This isn't just about getting the benefits you've earned. It's about reclaiming your dignity, your truth, and your place in a system that too often forgets the people it was meant to serve. We appreciate you watching today. If something in this video resonated with you, take a moment to let us know in the comments. Share the one thing you learned or the one thing you're now going to double check in your own case. Your insight might be exactly what someone else needs to hear. And if you haven't already, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss another video that can make all the difference. Thanks for being here, and until next time, keep going. You're not alone in this.